everybody? It's your boy Gsluke here with our Thursday night football preview for the matchup between the surging Miami Dolphins heading to the Cincinnati Bengals, who were the hot topic coming into the year but have faltered to a 1-2 start. So will that young up-and-coming Miami team go out there and get to 4-0? Or will that Bengals team who made it the whole way to the Super Bowl last year go out there, show us what they were really made of last year, show what all the hype was about this offseason and get the job done there? Really a lot of question marks, a lot of headlines going into this game. But from the DFS perspective, at least for our side, just great contest, right? Anytime we get one of these primetime matchups, particularly when it's two top-end offenses, Draftkings tends to give us quite the selection from the GPP standpoint, and that is certainly the case here for Thursday. So going to touch on the game script, the over-under spread, a few of the injury situations that may or may not exist for the slate, and then go through my player pool and give you an idea of the sort of players that I'll have my eye on here for the Thursday night football matchup, and of course, some of the strategy involved with creating those lineups as well. All right, we've got our projections up, and just before we hop into the player-by-player breakdown, I want to give you some top-level perspective of what to expect in terms of a game script. And with the Vegas lines, it really tells us what to expect here because the Bengals are still favored by 4 points despite having their 1-2 record. And on the flip side, you got Miami, who's 3-0, who deserves a lot of respect. But Vegas says, not so fast, don't overreact after 3 weeks, still has the Bengals as sizable favorites. And anytime you have a spread favoring one team or the other, you're going to see a majority of the ownership on the team that is favored. However, for this Thursday night football game, I'm not sure if it's going to be that same sort of effect. A lot of the public sentiment at this point is that the Dolphins, after beating the Buffalo Bills, have to be legit because, everyone was giving the Bills the crown, the Super Bowl, after the first 2 weeks. So the team that took them down has to be in contention at that point. I would say pump the brakes, much like the rest of Vegas. This Bengals team made it to the Super Bowl last year, has already shown the experience and the ability to get to that sort of game. And you have Joe Burrow, who's had a lackluster start to the year, has not been firing on all cylinders. That's going to figure it out at some point. He's one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. He has one of the best offenses in general to operate in the entire NFL. You're talking about 3 wide receiver 2s at the very least. Jamar Chase, who's a top 3 wide receiver in all of the NFL. Hayden Hurst, who was added to the mix. An O-line that has had its struggles over the first few weeks. But last year, it's not like it wasn't already a problem to begin with. You had record-level sacks for somebody like a Joe Burrow. And even throughout the playoffs, it plagued them from time to time. But given how high of a pedigree that Joe Burrow has, the just talent that they have in that offense, they were able to overcome that a lot more often than not, particularly towards the end of last season. And I expect to see that sort of offense, even with the problems on the O-line, sooner rather than later. And given that there's so much hype behind that Dolphins team, I think they're going to be a lot higher owned, at least than what my simulations are expecting at this point. So if you look at the ownership here, we are going to focus on the Bengals. I think that they are the team to target here, are the deserving favorites. We still have them at 56% owned, and that's for Joe Burrow. 41% on Jamar Chase, who is also the most expensive player on the slate, is significantly higher than a Tyreek Hill and a Jaylen Waddle. So, at this point of the week, the simulations that I'm running in terms of ownership are giving the Bengals a little bit more credit there. But I'd expect by the time we get to Thursday that the Dolphins are starting to pump up or get steamed up around the industry. Like I mentioned, they seem to be everyone's sweethearts at these points. So I'm expecting that, right? My early projections may say one thing, but by Thursday could drastically change. So if you're part of the Patreon page, if you're going to be here for the Thursday night live stream, which will be at 6 p.m. Eastern time, make sure to stop on by for that because a lot of these numbers that we're looking at here will not be the same by then. You could see a lot more ownership moving towards Miami. But in general, because of that sentiment, right, the ownership that I expect to go a little bit more towards Miami than the Bengals is going to keep me on this Bengals team. Like I mentioned, they have that upside. Joe Burrow is only $9,600. And while I think that he is viable at the captain, I love matching him up with some of these wide receivers at captain, right? Getting to a Jamar Chase, who has legit 30, 35 point ceiling. We're going to talk about T. Higgins a little bit later that also brings that same sort of ceiling to the table. Those captains are what I'm envisioning the game script to look like. I'm expecting this to be a relatively high-scoring game. The over-under is just 47 points, so it's not like it's an elite-level game where you're getting a 50-plus point total, but you have a competitive game script where it's just a 4-point spread, a team that's 3-0 that is actually the underdog here. I expect a lot of these pass catchers, whether it's, of course, the captains over there for the Bengals to go off, or some of the buybacks like a Jaylen Waddle or a Tyreek Hill, to also be in a great situation to succeed. So just because they're blacked out in here doesn't mean that I don't like them. Keep that in mind. I can only give you guys so many projections on here. If you want access to everything I have to offer, those are on my Patreon page. So make sure to check that out. If you're looking for a link, there is one in the description of the video. And you get access to everything I have to offer. My player pool, projections, ownership, all of that sort of fun stuff. And also as it changes throughout the week. But Tyreek Hill, Jaylen Waddle still project decently well, even though I do expect them to lose this game. They're going to get some ownership and mostly using them as a buyback. So because I'm going with a Cincinnati sort of stack, taking a lot of 4-2s and 5-1s when it comes to the Bengals, Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle, they're going to be used more of as like a one-off, particularly if I'm going with a 5-1 stack. Or if I'm going with a 4-2, it might be taking somebody like a Tyreek Hill or a Waddle and then going to one of the cheaper value options. Like we're going to talk about Gesicki a little bit later on. You could take Jason Sanders there at kicker, or even some of the pure punt plays like a River Craycraft, who's caught a few touchdowns to this point, believe it or not. Alec Ingold, who's always getting looks for the Dolphins down there on the goal line because Mike McDaniels absolutely has an obsession with using fullbacks there in the red zone. You could take any of those sort of players. But the Dolphins in general, for me, are more one-offs or buybacks. I'm trying to fit as many of these Bengals into lineups as possible. Because again, like I said, I do think they win this game. So Burrow makes a lot of sense. I'm using him anytime I'm using one of the Bengals captains. In terms of other guys you can mix in, Joe Mixon, pun intended there, is a great option. He's going to get plenty of touches out of the backfield. If you're expecting the Bengals to be the dominant team here, to dictate a lot of the action, a lot of his touches out of the backfield, any receptions that he's getting in that sort of usage are just going to further bolster his value. And he's only $9,000. If he was coming in on form, had multiple 20-plus point performances to this point, Joe Mixon would be the most expensive player on this slate, particularly because of their favorites, right? Normally the running back for the favorite team gets a little bit of a bump in terms of the pricing, but given how poorly he has played to this point, a lot of that is injury dictated. He's not expected to be out this week, should be a little bit more healthy than what we've seen through the first 2 weeks. Could absolutely smash at that price tag. So Joe Mixon, again, I know it's blacked out there, but I still do like him there. Tua, I don't hate as a buyback. Now, if I'm doing so, it's going to be as like one of the 4-2 stacks where I'm taking, 4 players from the Bengals, maybe taking Tua and a Jaylen Waddle as the buyback. Now, that's a little bit expensive. If I'm doing so, I'm not playing Jamar Chase at captain. You're not going to be able to build those sort of lineups. I'm probably taking one of my value captains, right? So I'm not going to have a ton of Tua. A lot of that is just due to opportunity cost. If I'm running a 5-1 or even a cheaper 4-2 where I'm not spending up for 2 players right around $10,000 for my buyback team, guys like Tua you can't fit into that lineup, right? Because if I'm going to take Tua, I have to take a pass catcher too. He's not going to go out there, rush for 3-4 touchdowns. So to invest that much into my buyback stack, I have to be in a relatively unique situation with the Bengals side of it. So I'm not going to have a ton of Tua, but I'm not excluding him from my player pool. He is more than viable to get there, especially from the flex position. I think he has a lot of utility there. The issue for me is my builds, right? I'm going for more of a Bengals heavy stack, and by doing so, it's going to keep me off of guys like Tua just because, I have to take one of those wide receivers with him. In terms of this mid-tier, before we get to the value plays, T. Higgins, I think, is maybe the best captain on the slate. He's at $8,200, so at captain, you're only investing $12,000, which still gives you plenty of salary to work with the rest of your lineup. On top of that, he has a true 35-point ceiling. We saw that at least 3 times last year. When he's really working out there in a rhythm with Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase can go out there, have that performance, and we saw T. Higgins multiple times last year also take over that role. And given that he's a little bit cheaper, maybe if you took T. Higgins at captain, you might be able to take a Tua and a Jaylen Waddle or somebody like a Tyreek Hill, right, as the 2 buybacks that you're going with. So I like that sort of build quite a bit. I do like Jamar Chase, though. More often than not, he will get to his ceiling more than somebody like T. Higgins, but they both have that top-end upside in their range of outcomes. Samaje Perine is the backup for Cinci. He's a little bit overpriced here because of the injury situation to Joe Mixon. Doesn't really project very well, so probably a stay away for me. Tyler Boyd's the slot wide receiver. He doesn't get nearly enough usage, but if he can score a touchdown and get you 4 or 5 catches, he could sneak into the optimal. Just doesn't project for a ton of upside, right? He doesn't have that 30, 35 point performance in him, much like a T. Higgins or Jamar Chase. So not somebody I'm using at the captain slot, but I think at the flex spot makes more than enough sense. Chase Edmonds, I almost actually talked up as one of the picks on here, but I decided to focus a little bit more on, Gesicki, who's a little bit cheaper, but also the Bengals in general. But Chase Edmonds, even in a losing game script, should see a little bit of usage out of the backfield. He does have sure hands, can run routes out of the slot if necessary too. So I would expect him to still at least have enough opportunity to succeed, even if they do get clobbered by the Bengals here. And anytime they get into the red zone, you have to think that he's the number one option down there to score a touchdown. And anytime you're dealing with a team that's, at least with the script that I'm playing, expected to lose there, a lot of their production is going to be dependent on touchdown production, right? Because they're not going to put up as much yardage. I like these running backs even more, especially for buybacks for that reason. Hayden Hurst is a decent pick for Joe Burrow stacks. He's relatively cheap, so if you're trying to get to a Jamar Chase, he's a great number 2 wide receiver to stack with a Joe Burrow to make that sort of lineup work. Mike Gesicki is another player I love using as a buyback for the Dolphins, another tight end. We know we have to love ourselves a few of these tight ends for Showdown. Just time and time again, they go out there and score a touchdown. But Gesicki to this point has had plenty of touchdowns vultured. You have multiple touchdowns for River Craycraft, who has stolen those 1-yard touchdowns from a Mike Gesicki. You also have Alec Ingold, who's stolen a few touchdowns, and a few other of these fringe wide receivers that have seen action rather than Gesicki. And I know it's volatile, touchdown production could be so random from week to week, but last year Gesicki was getting a ton of looks in the red zone, and I know to this point it hasn't really looked that way. It'll change at some point, and now that he's lower owned and also going to be much lower priced than he should be because of all of that, I think it's a time to buy in. Raheem Mostert's the backup. I do think he's worth a few looks though, because much like a Chase Edmonds, he has a ton of that touchdown equity, and if he ends up getting into the end zone, that would be enough at $4,400. I love myself the kickers here. McPherson is fine if you're going with like a 5-1 stack for the Bengals, but Jason Sanders, because he's only $3,800, is a great option as a buyback for some of those 4-2 or 5-1 Bengals stacks. So like both kickers, Jason Sanders or Evan McPherson, I think both of them have quite a bit of utility. Now, I wouldn't pull Graham Gano. I want to go and put him at the captain slot and hope that he's optimal. It's only going to happen like once or twice a year, and sure, it did happen for the last primetime slate, but I wouldn't count it. I wouldn't count on it happening 2 slates in a row. Let's just go out and say that. In terms of your pure fringe or pure flyer options at the bottom of the board down here, the defenses I'm not a huge fan of. I do think that there'll be a good amount of scoring unless there's a defensive touchdown. More than likely not even getting into the optimal at flex. You have Durham Smythe, who will see a few snaps at tight end. He's kind of lost his role, though, to guys like a River Craycraft, who obviously at $2,400, I'm not investing in. He's got to get you that 1-yard touchdown to get there. Cedric Wilson Jr. is questionable, so he may or may not play. If he doesn't, guys like Trent Sherfield might get a little bit more playing time. You have guys like Salvin Ahmed, who's the number 3 running back for the Dolphins. Last year actually saw quite a bit of time. This year has hardly been used. So if you think at $200 that he can at least see a few snaps out there as active for the game, then maybe at the pure minimum, you take a shot on him hoping that he can score a touchdown, maybe get you that 25 to 30-yard rush. But you're really just taking pure flyers down here. There's nobody that you can really rely on, at least in any sort of reliable fashion or consistent fashion. Mike Thomas, number 4 wide receiver for the Bengals. He might see 10 to 15% of snaps. Chris Evans, going to be used on a few third downs for the Bengals, but they have been using Samaje Perine quite a bit of late. Just, if you're playing 150 lineups, I could see playing anybody from Smythe down, except for maybe, honestly, except for Wilcox. I could see, and Aussie, I would say. Outside of these 2 players, I probably would play everyone else down here, right? Mike Thomas, Ahmed, Evans, Ingold, Sherfield, Craycraft, even Smythe. All of these players do have an opportunity to get to that optimal lineup, right? They're going to be super low owned, give you plenty of flexibility. It's just that if I was playing a 2 to 3 max, a single entry, even a 20 max, right, where I only have 20 combinations to work with, I'm not sure how many I'd be willing to get to. Maybe 1, maybe 2, if I was feeling a little bit frisky about it in that sort of lineup. I'd mostly want to try and focus on the kickers. Some of these middle tier options like, Raheem Mostert we talked about, love Hayden Hurst and Gesicki. Those sort of builds are a little bit more consistent long term, but hey, if you're playing 150 lineups like I'm going to, then by all means, feel free to get to those sort of lineups. All right, boys, that is all I've got for this DFS preview. Going to have a live stream on Thursday evening at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, covering the inactives and actives list that come out. We'll talk GPP strategy, any ownership changes, any live questions that you have down there in chat. Overall, just preparing you for that night slate. So looking forward to that. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel if you haven't already so you don't miss that content in the future. Also, before you hop on out of here, go ahead and smash that like button. And best of luck with all of your lineups for Thursday. I'm looking forward to it. You know, the Steelers aren't playing this time in prime time, so we don't have to worry about any of my personal allegiances there. You can just sit back, get ourselves a good sweat over here with DFS, and enjoy a competitive, hopefully, competitive football game. So best of luck, everybody, and I'll see you guys for that stream on Thursday.